to learners communities and the most disadvantaged communities. We will take their voice and make it sound inside the European Parliament and defend the interests of participation and improve the daily lives of learners, because I think it's fundamental to have quality education and quality participation all across the European Union.
Across Europe, many organisations and institutions are working to strengthen participation in education. Learners are often invited to share their views, yet the step from expressing an opinion to shaping a decision is not always straightforward. Understanding how different actors approach this question can help us to clarify what meaningful participation can look like in practice. Today we talk about this with Ros Sempere, Member of the European Parliament, and Brikena Xhomaqi, Director of the Lifelong Learning Platform. Their perspectives bring together an institutional viewpoint and the experience of civil society, offering us a broader picture of how participation can be supported and how learners can be included more effectively in policymaking processes. This is the Enhanced Podcast, a series which focuses on learner voice, participation and inclusion in adult education. I'm Aoife, Communications Officer at Solidar. The series is part of the Enhanced Project, a project co-funded by the European Union which works to support democratic practices in education and to strengthen the role of learners in shaping their learning environments. Here's my conversation with Ros and Brikena. Thank you both for joining me today. First, if I can ask you to introduce yourselves, maybe I will pass to Ros first.
Hello, everyone. I am Marcos Ros. I am member of the European Parliament, Spanish member on the group of Socialists and Democrats, and I belong to the Committee on Culture and Education, and I have been related to education and youth participation engagement during the 5 years that I have been acting as a member of the European Parliament.
And now I'll hand over to you, Brikena, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm Brikena, the Director of the Lifelong Learning Platform, the European Civil Society for Education and Training, which is an umbrella organization gathering all education and training stakeholders from early ages to throughout life, so in elder ages as well. And I've been also quite engaged in the youth organization students movement before I joined the Lifelong Learning Platform.
Great, thank you both. So perhaps we can start by talking about how participatory processes can ensure that learner voices are heard in the policymaking process. So Marcos, first I'll turn to you. How have you found as a policymaker that civil society can be involved to ensure that participatory processes include diverse learner voices, perhaps with a particular emphasis on those voices from more underrepresented backgrounds?
Okay, first of all, let me remind to everyone that our treaties, especially the Article 11 of the Treaty of the European Union, obliges the European Union to institutions to maintain an open, transparent, and regular dialogue with civil society. Once says that, I think that an article of an international treaty cannot be ignored, cannot be a footnote, and cannot be a wishful thought. They are very important for us, and we have to push and foster to complement with these articles. So once said that, I think that the European institutions have developed a lot of instruments and tools that maybe we can develop during the podcast, like the EU Youth Dialogue, the Youth Check, the Youth Test, the Conference of the Future of Europe, the Direct Access, and other tools. But I think that the freshest ideas come always from outside, from the civil society organizations, and more often they cannot always from, or the majority of the time, they cannot from privileged neighborhoods, but from people who are marginalized or underrepresented. So we had to recognize that democracy not only live in institutions or societies. We have to encourage societies to go inside, to make on-site consultations, and to try to arrive to these underrepresented or marginalized communities one by one, not staying at home, not staying at the office, but going outside and trying to make the direct calls for these communities. But for this, I think it's very important to take into consideration the civil society organizations, but address to them to go specifically to these communities.
Brikena, would you like to pick up on anything that was said there, and in particular, I suppose, with regard to civil society and its role in bringing diverse voices to the policymaking process? What strategies have proved effective in engaging learners in policymaking processes, in your experience?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I would agree with Marcos in what he shared, and I would add to that I mean, democracy, the beauty of democracy is the diversity of forms that one has to participate in the society. But to our understanding and knowledge, the first form, or let's say after the family, the classroom is another space where democracy takes place and should be nurtured and taught. And we believe that it's very important that the education and training institutions from early ages encourage that type of democratic structures and have democratic structures in order for learners to participate in and to defend their rights from really early ages. And I think it's very important that there is this democratic culture in the education and training system throughout all the system, but also that indeed this gives the opportunity and encourages learners to participate in the society through civil society organizations. There are plenty of community organizations that are surrounding the school or the university or the training center or any other form of non-formal and informal learning environments and organizations that provide that, where learners can engage in different forms and for different rights and they can participate actively in the society. So I think we need to encourage more of that and make sure that the barriers for participating are also taken out, because I remember myself as a student representative when I first started at university in Italy. I was a foreign student and I could not be elected at the Senate level as a student representative because I was a foreigner. So there are many obstacles. This is probably just more related to migration background, but there are plenty of others, such as social, economic, also barriers that do not encourage learners to engage in civil society or to engage in student movement or any youth movement as well. So this is very important that the enabling environments are also there to make that possible.
Thank you, Brikena. So you spoke a little bit there about the barriers that can face learners when trying to engage in or get involved in the policymaking process. How do you think that civil society and policymakers can work together to overcome these barriers? And this is a question for both of you, but maybe I can start with you, Brikena, if you'd like to develop this a bit further.
I think it's a hard question in the sense that by default, we are there to create those spaces and to overcome those barriers and engage as many learners, as many citizens, as many people as possible in the civil society. But in fact, not all of us, and not at the extent that we should, are inclusive enough. And that has different aspects. And it's something that we need to continue working on how to become more inclusive organizations. And that's something, for instance, that we are working right now at the Lifelong Learning platform, how to make our organizations more inclusive by making training the staff also to introduce more engaging, more inclusive approaches to get younger generations in, or all generations active in civil society. So I think we also have to rethink the way we are structured, the way we welcome new people in, and especially nowadays that younger generations have different forms of participation, such as social media and all sort of online engagement. And so they don't see anymore the usual traditional civil society structures fitting for them. And it's important that they can actually find also themselves in civil society. So yeah, I think we don't have the answer to how we can do that yet, but we need to work on that, I believe. and we need to all join different forces together. There are plenty of examples of organizations, especially in the youth movement, where they try to indeed, for instance, introduce solidarity funds, solidarity actions, in order to allow organizations or people that have disadvantages and that have barriers to engage, to overcome them. So this is one way of doing it. The other way is to reaching out and having inclusion and diversity strategies in our organizations that make sure that everyone can engage and is not discriminated for any reason. So I think these are probably some first important steps that we need to take, and there is a lot of work still to be done for us to be fully inclusive. And we need also the support of policymakers to do that, because that depends a lot on our capacity and resources that we have. So our resources are also very scarce, and the capacities also sometimes are scarce when it comes to becoming more inclusive and having such robust structures to be diverse and inclusive. So yeah, we need to work together to make that possible.
Maybe on this point, I can turn to you then, Marcos. How do you see the cooperation between civil society and policymakers in this regard? And how can institutions really foster spaces for meaningful participation?
Yes, I think that Brikena has already some key points that I fully share, but I think that policymakers and civil society organizations, we are already working together, and this I think this is much more necessary, and we have to strengthen this work. So I don't think that we are not working together, and we need to work together. I think that we need to strengthen the ways in we are doing now. For example, I can mention the initiative Youth Check, which is a useful tool to ensure that the impact of the new policies that we are creating and addressing at the EU level, in the Parliament, in the Council, and then the Commission is putting into force. An assessment tool should be strengthened and should be for everything, not only for like a pilot action and approve. Okay, we have made some checks, but we need to go further. The same with the youth test, which is very similar, but for the advisory bodies' opinions. Our program like Erasmus Plus, European Solidarity Corps, and they already saw how CSOs can work together, because there are intermediate revision that take into account what CCO says and so on. So I think that for us is very important, because CSOs are bringing the perspective from the ground, from the reality to the institutions. In some cases, the perspective that the institutions we don't cover, because even if we are trying to get to be in close contact with the reality, you are more. CSOs are more in contact with the reality, because it's your real work, it's a day by day daily work. And I think that policymakers, we must recognize and give CSOs the tools, the resources, and the spaces to be part of the process. But this is not like a privilege or a favor, but as a democratic obligation and a good way to design better policies. So sometimes we receive criticism about that we are privileging or giving money for NGOs or CSOs, and this is very far from being privileges or favors. This is a way to improve the policies that we need to adopt and to put into force.
Moving away then a little bit from how this cooperation works in practice and to focus more on policy design and process, what policy frameworks or guidelines will support the integration of learner voices into policymaking? And Marcos, I can come to you first here. What kind of policy frameworks are effective in this regard, and how can policymakers ensure that civil society and learners are meaningfully participating in the development of these policies?
Yes, I think that education, if you ask to me, I am dealing with education all my life, because I'm also a professor, very close to young people at the university. I think that education in all levels is our silver bullet. It can create everything that we want, and I think that we have to improve civil learning during the school years. For example, we advocated during the past term for the implementation of European citizenship education in all school levels of the European Union. This can plant the seed of participation, because civil education teaches that democracy is the only thing real when as many people as possible take part. But we cannot only plant a seed. We need to water this seed. We need to take care of this seed and to see how the tree is growing. And we need to create permanent spaces where people are truly listening. I think that we cannot work without education. I think that good education is a fundamental tool, but we have to be honest. Quality education is not cheap, it's expensive, but we have to improve our budget, national, regional, local, and European Union budget, to improve our civil learning or citizenship education. But I also think that civil society organization, you have the responsibility to remind policymakers that we have to be very aware and we have to invest in education, because if not, at the end we have not very well learned society. They will fall into hate speeches, disinformation, populism, extremism that we are facing now all across Europe. So I think it's very important to create environments that encourage, as you was asking, meaningful learner participation.
Thank you, Marcos. And turning then to you, Brikena, if you'd like to pick up on anything that was said there, and in particular about how civil society and policymakers can work together to design processes that really respond to the needs of learners.
Yeah, I just wanted to say indeed that I fully agree with Marcos on the role of education and it being crucial for building democratic societies and engaging young and old people, actually. So I would fully agree on that, and on the fact that we need to create the spaces, because education alone will not be enough if there is no space to practice. And if there are no structures where you can practice that learning. So that is very important. And for that to happen, in my opinion, and that's where we can work more together with the civil society and the policymakers, is that there is one important step to make, is to recognize the rich diversity of learning environments. So going beyond the traditional schools, where people learn, how they learn, and for which purposes. And broadening up the definition of the learning environment and recognizing, valuing all those learning environments. One of them being also civil society, and recognizing civil society also being a learning space. I think it's a very important step to make. And then we can see how different policies can address different needs at different spaces. And it is important that together with policymakers, we can actually advocate and manage to have this holistic approach to education in our EU policies as well. So that holistic would mean that the policies would affect people in different environments where they are in different forms and catering to their needs. So that is very important. And how we can work together. I mean, there are plenty of initiatives at the moment that we are already working with Marcos, and we'll still have to work. You mentioned a very important threat for civil society currently ongoing in the European Parliament. It's very important that we continue to work together to change the narrative and correct the narrative and trust civil society as the key partner rather than the contrary, and working together on policies such as at the moment the Union of Skills, which foresees in one of its actions also the provision of basic skills for citizens in Europe. And within that, citizenship education, for instance, and citizenship skills are also considered as a basic skill for individuals to have. So that is a policy file we will need to work. And then I think the very important policy file we need to cooperate together is the upcoming EU budgets, so the multi-financial framework, and within it, the very important program that supports citizens' engagement, young and elder people, which is the Erasmus Plus program. And that is a key flagship EU initiative that we need to make sure it continues, is enriched, is even bigger and more important, and it will actually be one of the programs that will help us to achieve also a more democratic society. So yeah, that's probably an area where we could continue to work together.
So you both touched on what's already in place at EU level in this regard. So maybe we can speak more about what more can be done. What do you think that the EU can do more to support member states and civil society within the member states to implement participatory processes that include learner voices?
I think what the EU can do is, if we take the current discussions on the next EU budget, I think is to really mainstream the support to civil society and making sure that they can actually play that role and they can do their job by supporting and building their capacities and providing resources for them to do that in cooperation, of course, with the member states, with the different authorities at national, regional and local level, because in fact, local authorities have a lot to say as well. So we need to really look at the different governance structures that will enable all those to take place. So it's very important that the EU supports that in the next EU budget. That is really mainstream. There will be indeed the Agora EU, which is dedicated to civil society, but we still believe that this is one solution among many, and we need to mainstream throughout all the EU programs and throughout all the EU budgets. We should foresee a key role for civil society in the implementation of the policies, in raising awareness about those policies and reaching those policies with the learner's voice. And for that, we play a key role in the implementation and raising awareness. Without us, the EU cannot reach the learners, and we are key players to reach the learner and make sure that the learner has a voice and has the rights to raise that voice to the different policies that are on EU level.
Coming to you then, Marcos, from the policy-making perspective, what more do you believe the EU can do to support member states and civil society in this regard?
Well, I think that EU has done a lot of things to support the member states and the regional and local authorities. European institutions have done a lot, but they share the same idea. Participation must be real, not just symbolic. So I think that we have to strengthen this idea, and we know that if we have clear and open channels showing how young people input is used and making their involvement as a regular part of policy making, it should be a good idea, not just a one-time event and we forget the conclusions that come from the event. I think that the real challenge now is not to create more declarations or more decisions or more legislation, but to make sure that the many that we have already are applied consistently and effectively at every level, and they are integrating people voices into institutions. Maybe we can stop making this legislation, but we can create evaluation systems, check systems, surveys to see how them are functioning. I think it's very important because sometimes politicians, I have to admit, we design a policy, we make a declaration, we make a decision, we implement a regulation, but then we leave them pass and we don't check if they are functioning or not. We don't make an evaluation and we don't send a big survey to all the community in a specific place or in the whole European Union. And it is very important to have the feedback. So I think on the intention, we have done a lot of things, and I think that we have the path very clear market. The collaboration between the CSOs, the member states, the regional and local authorities, the European Union institutions, we have everything, but we need to effectively implement them and check the functioning of them to correct them And I think this is the path that we have ahead for the incoming years.
Thank you both. To finish up then, this can be a moment to reflect on your own experiences. Can you maybe share an example of a situation in which learner input significantly influenced a policy decision, and what was the outcome of this? And Marcos, if you'd like to go first, if you have something in mind.
Yes, for sure. I think that, for example, during the conference of the future of Europe, young people, they submitted proposal, they focused on digitalization and sustainability, and afterwards the path of the political main strategies of the European Union were addressed on digitalization and sustainability. So we really listen. When we open a real process, I think that we really listen to them. Sometimes when I go to schools or high schools and make a conference, and young student, 12, 13, 14 years old, they ask me a lot about the climate change, the environment, the future. I say, you were during dozens of Fridays being at the main door of the parliaments are all around the world, and we listen to you. So when there is a process, formal or not formal, because this was the Fridays for Future, it was not a formal participatory process, but it was a process. We try to listen, and we listen to the voices of the young people, and we engage with that. The same with the 2022 European Union Youth Dialogue. Young people contributed to national consultations and European conference. They share perspective, and their input was incorporated into the 2022 Council conclusions. And the intermediate Erasmus Plus program evaluation, the feedback that come from the CSOs and people is used every time, is used to adjust or readjust this program priorities. In this case, for example, increasing the focus on inclusion and diversity, or improving access for students from disadvantaged background. And this came from the students or the Erasmus organization. So I think that when we make a clear participatory process, we used to take the results from this process, and we used to incorporate the voices that come from the young people into the following decisions, legislation, or regulations.
Thank you. And Brikena, then, if I can turn to you, do you have an example in mind of when a learner voice has shaped a policy decision?
Like Marcos said as well, I mean, I think there are plenty of examples of good examples. I don't have in mind one particular case, but I could mention, for instance, in the last, let's say, consultations on the Union of Skills, where we were consulted regularly as stakeholders, including also the learners' organizations, in shaping that agenda. I think what I mentioned before about the basic skills and the citizenship education was something that we raised as a big concern. And we think we were heard to some extent, because in fact it was included. So that was a success in that regard, of raising our consensus learners and being heard. And another aspect in there that's also we raised and we believe we were heard in a way was also when we called for community lifelong learning centers, which is creating this space for getting closer to disadvantaged learners from all ages. And that somehow also is now in the Union of Skills agenda. So we are really happy that that was possible. There are plenty of other examples in the past when it comes to the Erasmus Plus as well. Like Marcos said, we have always been heard. Maybe not to the extent we would have wished, but we managed to somehow get an increase of the budget, which we were asking for, because we had plenty of learners that wanted to have the opportunity to go abroad or to use the Erasmus opportunities. And so the demand is high, and we asked for more budget. And even if it wasn't as big as we wished for, we still got an increase in a very difficult time for the EU financially. So that's a sign that we were heard as well. So I believe, yeah, there are plenty of good examples. As of course, there might be also frustrations with examples that probably we haven't managed to reach the expectations. But yeah, there is room for improvement for everyone.
Thank you very much to you both for your insights and for giving us a super fruitful discussion there. Before we finish up, are there any final comments you'd like to make?
As a final comment, I will say that we have many challenges ahead now. As of now, we have 4 years ahead of this term. But the main discussion that we have now on the floor is the next MFF. And maybe someone may think that the MFF is only a budgetary document, but the budget is the main tool that mark the path for doing politics. So now is the turn of the policymakers, but now is the time also for CCOs to push policymakers to improve the proposal that came from the European Commission. On terms of culture and education, the proposal is not so bad like in other terms, but we need to improve this proposal. We need to strengthen the budget for Erasmus Plus initiative. We need to strengthen and split and have a specific budget for people participation and young people activities and programs in coming years in the European Union. And as a last comment, don't hesitate to count on policymakers, because we are here to listen to our voters, but also to CSOs, to all the organizations, and to listen all the communities, and in my case, especially dedicated to learners communities and the most disadvantaged communities. We will take their voice and make it sound inside the European Parliament and defend the interests of participation, youth engagement on politics, and improve the daily lives of the young people, because I think it's fundamental to have quality education and quality participation all across the European Union. Thank you, Solidar, and it's been a real pleasure.
What you've just heard is the Enhanced Podcast, a series focused on learner voice, participation and inclusion in adult education. The Enhanced Podcast is co-funded by the European Union. If you're interested in learning more about Solidar's work on education and lifelong learning, you can find our social media in the episode description or visit solidar.org.